Добрый день. Я рада представить вам нашего очередного спикера. Для меня это тоже человек особенный. Это не просто член общины Shaarei Shalom, это человек, который вошел в этом году в совет общины, Сергей Kozin. Сергей Kozin обучался в разных странах, в том числе в Америке, наукам, связанным с изучением религии, библеистики, социологии, антропологии, религии, технологий и так далее. Участвует он на сегодняшний день в международных издательских проектах, и целый год уже в нашей общине с осени 2019 года, в общине Shaarei Shalom, Сергей ведет книжный клуб по иудаике и смежным дисциплинам. То есть мы делаем обзоры интересных книг, их обсуждаем. Сергей любит неоднозначные сюжеты, темы вроде религия и марксизм, история религиозных левых. Сегодня Сергей прочитает для нас лекцию на английском языке. Мы сможем, так сказать, потом позже поделиться такой же лекцией. Ну, конечно, такой же не получится, наверное, какой-то другой, но тоже по этой же теме на русском языке позже, уже на канале Shaarei Shalom. И пару слов скажу о Сергее на английском. Sergei Kozin, he's a lifetime student of religion with interest spanning biblical studies, sociology and religion, Marxism, and so on. And he's involved in a number of publishing projects in his fields of expertise. At Shaarei Shalom community, he leads a Russian language book club where we discuss recent publications in Jewish studies. This session is an attempt to do the same for an English-speaking audience. So, stage is yours.
Okay, can you see me? Hello, everyone. How is the sound? Слышно меня, да? Okay. So, greetings, everyone. This afternoon, November 22nd. I'm very privileged to be a speaker in this conference, and I have to make a number of disclaimers before we begin about myself and about the nature of the event we're having here. So Allah has briefly introduced myself, and she mentioned that this is in the format of a book club, which I have initiated at the Shaarei Shalom community in St. Petersburg. So the format is the one of a book club. However, the way it works is actually we're mostly primarily discussing books that have been published in English rather than Russian, whereas the majority of the people who come to the book club are members of the community, and their capacity for English is fairly limited. So I basically speak on what I have read and what I have understood in one or another book in Jewish studies, and there's not much of a response beyond the fact that people have general interest to this or that subject area, and they have a general awareness of what I'm talking about, and I'm trying to pick up my subjects, my topics, the way it could be interesting to my audience. But still, this is not a typical book club the way people are familiar with in the English-speaking world, where people read a book before they come to the session, and then they actually discuss it as a group. So, my role is a bit different. I rather speak as a speaker, as a lecturer in these book clubs. And then the second disclaimer is that, of course, the book club is in English, which I have never done before, neither in the synagogue nor elsewhere. I have taught various subjects in religious studies before, but as far as a book club concerned, this is my first attempt. And also, this is the first time I actually lecture in a Zoom format. So I've been an auditor before. I've taken part in some of the events in this particular conference for the World Union, Friends Stay United. But as far as being myself a presenter, this is the first time I'm doing it. And finally, English is not my native language, as most of you have already realized by that point, which I don't feel bad about it. It's just the fact. So if I'm making mistakes or Any awkwardness in the expression, please bear with me. Again, this is the first time I'm doing it in this particular format, and actually I haven't spoken English in a while to a group, and it makes it particularly difficult for me that I don't see any of you in front of me, so I'm basically speaking to myself. To me, it sort of brings up the experience of being a patient, with a psychologist, especially these days when you don't see your psychologist, but you have to do a Zoom session. You basically speak to a screen, and you don't see the person. So anyway, with all these disclaimers, maybe one more disclaimer is that I'm not a historian by no means, but however, the subject I've chosen for this presentation is a historical one. It deals with the red anti-Semitism, and particularly with how the Bolsheviks responded to the wave of pogroms in the early years of the Russian Revolution, and how Jewish intellectuals actually played a role in crafting those responses. So there's a lot of historical detail in the book itself, which I will introduce shortly. And the challenge for me is that I'm mostly interested in this subject on a more general level. So rather than particular historical facts or a chain of events and how it unfolded in those years, I'm interested in a more general question, which Allah basically has mentioned in introducing me. I'm interested primarily in this difficult subjects and difficult combinations, uneasy combinations between things like, for example, religion and Marxism. Another combination for me, just to follow the train of thought, is a combination between Judaism and Christianity. That's another subject that interests me personally and as a scholar as well. But that's for another session perhaps. So I'm approaching this particular book, which I will be speaking about, from a more general sort of interest and hunch, namely that the very uneasiness in the relationship between religion and Marxism, religion and leftist movements, and particularly in this country where I'm speaking from currently, Russia, the Russian Federation. This very uneasiness has something, maybe in a kind of a psychological way, has some unacknowledged inner core, unacknowledged inner problem within it, which all these historical problems keep circling around. And the problem is that there is indeed a certain degree of correspondence between the projects of religion and there's a certain degree of correspondence between the projects of religion and the projects of Marxism. So I've spent some years actually studying this for my sort of personal academic work. I still have an unfinished project, which I'll hopefully will finish in the foreseeable future, which has to do with how Bolsheviks themselves developed their idea of religion, and how their understandings were in fact very diverse, which is perhaps not something that not everyone in this country will readily acknowledge, that the Bolshevik and the Marxist response, the Russian Marxist response to religion was far more diverse and far more interesting than the anti-religious campaigns we all know about. So I've done some work on Lunacharsky in particular, and his ideas about religion and about culture, and how religion actually develops historically and what it means for Marxism itself. So this book I'm going to speak about is sort of falls within this general area of interest of myself, and I hope you will be able to feel some of it, and maybe even share some of my passion for the topic. And now I'm ready to come to the book itself. The book was published last year 2019 by Cambridge University Press, if I'm not mistaken. And the author is Brendan McGeever, and the title is Anti-Semitism and the Russian Revolution. Okay. I'll take a sip of water. So the general idea of the book is that, no, not yet, I'll show the screen later, we'll come to it. The general idea of the book, okay, I'll have it in front of me, is to explore, actually it helps to see all on the screen. I wonder if I can minimize and see both the book and the face in front of me. But anyway, the general idea of the book is precisely to study this uneasy relationship between religion and Marxism in the early years of the Russian Revolution. And specifically, the question is the question of anti-Semitism, okay, which is, of course, familiar to this audience we're within right now, and probably to everyone, in the world globally, because people are generally aware of what happened in the 21st century, late in the 21st century, particularly during the Second World War, the Holocaust, and everything else. But the book explores the early years of the Soviet power, the years from 1917 until 1921. So this is the time of the October Revolution and what came after the Civil War, when, if some of the people from the English-speaking audience do not remember, the Civil War was basically the struggle between the forces that supported the revolution, that supported the Bolsheviks, and those who were against them. So, and it was a struggle that involved whole sections of population. And as the author reminds us time and again in the book, this is the kind of conflict that we have to approach from a more contemporary intersectional framework in mind. Intersectionalism means that we look at the problem not only from the point of view of class, which is very common and standard for a Marxist analysis of history of society in general, right? We primarily analyzing how class relations work, the relations of power, the relations of economical power, to begin with, and then all other sorts of power. But intersectional analysis goes beyond that and also wants to include such aspects as gender and ethnicity, race. So the book is in this framework, and I've also been lucky to have listened to the interview of the author, Brendan McGeever. Sorry, I don't remember names easily. McGeever, which he did for the New Books Network recently, where he describes both his project and his interest that drove him to writing the book. So, and that's the framework he also describes in this interview. That is that in order to analyze these Bolshevik responses to anti-Semitism, we need, actually the very problem dictates that we approach it not from a standard sort of Marxist perspective of class, of power relations, but also from the perspective of race. Actually, the missing aspect from the book, if we're talking about the intersectionality, the intersectional approach, is the perspective of gender. There's actually nothing I found in the book itself that has anything to do with gender. And of course, gendered violence was a big chunk of a big sort of picture of those anti-Semitic pogroms that the author is describing in the early years of the Soviet power. And that's probably unfortunate that he doesn't touch on this topic, but perhaps that would bring him to an entirely different area. Anyway, this particular framework of gender is missing, but the other two, class and race, are definitely there. So this is actually what makes the book very relevant, I think, both to myself and to the world we're living in right now, and not only here in Russia, and I will speak about it in a moment, but also internationally. I mean, even if we take the recent wave of protest in the United States, not the one that's going on right now in the aftermath of the elections, when there are different groups trying to influence the final verdict one way or another. But the wave of protest that preceded the election, that was the wave connected with the Black Lives Matter movement. And we even had a section in our book club when we discussed we discussed a book about Jewish radicalism in the United States in the 1920s, and that was right during the protests in the Black Lives movement. And I remember, as I was preparing for that session to talk about the book, okay, there's someone from California. So I remember, greetings. So I remember as I was preparing my talk, I was browsing through some of the news on the web about the Black Lives Matter protests, and there were pieces talking about Jewish involvement in those, and how Jews are actually divided in how to respond. Some Jews definitely felt had a sentiment that at least some part of those protests definitely carries an anti-Semitic flair, an anti-Semitic agenda, and there was slogans shouted and even property vandalized and so on and so forth. And then there were other articles and other reports about how Jews themselves were involved in those protests, sort of supporting the issue of the Black Lives Matter movement, and how the very movement actually used some of the slogans that were initially developed by the radical Jewish intelligentsia. Actually, I think there was a woman from Los Angeles who was a radical her life, and during one of the rallies, her specific slogans were shouted, as a rallying cry for the crowd. And of course, these slogans, particular slogans, they did not carry any anti-Semitic content whatsoever. So race and class and protest and radical protest are very much present in the kind of lives we're living, in kind of issues we're dealing with, because again, as this Black Lives Matter demonstrate, the issue of race and the issue of class, they're not closed. They have not been closed, neither by the Russian Revolution nor by what came afterwards. They're still with us. There's still all this injustices and imbalances in how people share wealth, and how they share power, how they have access to education, to medical care. And actually, the pandemic we're living through is another example of that. Right, there are other reports as to how, for example, medical care was or was not available in this or that ethnic community in the United States. So this is very much, an issue still, and this is very much an issue, I think, also for us here in Russia. Even though people may not actually be aware of that, and I speak particularly about myself and my own experience, because as I've mentioned, I have this weird combination of interests in religion and Marxism, religion and left movements. And myself, I'm a member of sort of both. I'm both a member of the community Shaarei Shalom, which is a progressive community. And it soothes my heart that I told this to all, I think, our second meeting, that it soothes my heart that the community physically the community is located in a building that stands right opposite the battleship Aurora in Petrograd, in Leningrad. So you just walk 100 meters, you cross the square, and you can have a tour of the battleship. Though this is not the actual battleship, as everyone knows, it has been restored over and over again. I think this is the third or the fourth copy. It's not genuine, yeah, except for maybe some artifacts. But still, you know, this is the historical symbol of the revolution. And the community is progressive, and I think in time, I hope we will develop some of that progressive agenda as well as a community. But beyond that, I'm also a member of one leftist organization in St. Petersburg. I have been for a couple of years now. It is called the Left Front. It sort of unites people from non-orthodox, I would say, Marxist circles, the ones who are not very much infused with the idea of building back the old Soviet model of communism, you know, with strong authoritarian power, you know, Stalin, even Stalin-like power, and with also with heavy burdens placed on religion, for example, and other things like cultural expressions. So it's a more heterodox, I would say, leftist movement here in St. Petersburg. Very small, but we're trying to be active in the conditions that are getting more and more difficult for us day after day, day by day, because if you follow the news, you know, the government has been really harsh on any informal expression of disagreement with what's going on. But within this, you know, leftist heterodox circles, I personally encountered situations when how people voiced their understanding of Marxism and religion could in fact involve an anti-Semitic element. Okay, for example, I personally stopped a couple of public publications on our website for our movement, leftist movement, which were openly anti-Semitic, and I had to sort of write an email and demand that they not do it, and they did remove it. But this kind of sentiment is very much present still in the leftist circles here in Russia. And every time I come, for example, to a communist rally, and I see pictures of Stalin and some slogans repeated, rehearsed back from the old Soviet days, you know, I get this feeling, you know, I struggle with this feeling that this reminds me of a very sort of poisoned attitude, not that just to religion in general, but to you know, to the Jewish religion in particular. Because there is, even if you follow some of the publications online for leftist circles in Russia, communist publications or quasi-communist, there's still a lot of talking about Jews, you know, having the levers of power in Russia, you know, having all these privileges as far as finance is concerned, politics, and so on and so forth. So this is still a problem, and I think the book of McGeever, it sort of along with the fact that it gives us a very neat, a very detailed historical presentation of how this issue of the relationship between Marxism and religion unfolded in the early Soviet days. It sort of looks at it from a very contemporary framework, as I've said before, which demands that we revisit this relationship, especially if you come from a more progressive leftist perspective. So I actually hope that when we finish this section and this session and have an opportunity to have another one in Russian, I'll invite some of my leftist friends and we'll have a discussion. But anyway, I've taken a lot of time sort of for the disclaimers, and we need to talk about the book itself. So I already mentioned that it is written from a contemporary perspective of intersectionalism, so combining race and class. And the author, Brendan McGeever, was educated in Glasgow. He's not a historian either. He's a sociologist by training, both his undergraduate work and graduate work. So he approaches the issue of the anti-Semitism and the Russian Revolution from a more general sociological perspective. That's what interests him. And he actually mentions in the interview that his family background is also has to do with leftist circles. His family had some exposure to Trotskyism, as far as I understand, and he has Jewish heritage and Irish heritage. So that's what interests him. The book itself consists of 6 chapters and epilogue, 7 chapters and the epilogue. And it is basically, even though he's not a historian, but it is a very detailed historical presentation of how the issue of the red Semitism unfolded during those years. Of course, he begins with what existed in the years prior to the revolution, the sort of general setup. Okay, I'm reading the comments. There's someone else from the United States. Kid Silver, greetings to Kid Silver from the United States. Sorry, I'll take a sip of water. So he goes very detailedly to starting from what in fact we had as far as Marxist and socialist responses to anti-Semitism before the revolution, and he describes that, and then he says he explains how this all relates to how responses were crafted in the when Bolsheviks actually came to power, and he sort of describes this very interesting. Well, as far as I'm concerned, it's interesting, a very interesting situation for the Social Democrats, and of course, when I say Bolsheviks, the earlier name for the Russian Bolsheviks were the Socialist Democratic Labor Party. That's the original name which they inherited from their German compatriots. There were no Bolsheviks initially; they were called the Social Democrats, which distinguished them from other leftist parties. But anyway, so the initial response was in the socialist movement itself before the revolution. It was sort of crafted. It was the whole framework was set up by how this nascent socialist movements responded to the first wave of pogroms in the Russian Empire. And this wave, as we know, it came about with the fact of the assassination of Tsar Alexander II. And of course, Jews were immediately suspects of that murder, of the blowing up of the Tsar right here in St. Petersburg, not far from where I'm talking from right now. Even though none of the Jews were apparently involved in the very murder attempt, but still there was a wave of pogroms. And the way it worked in the socialist movement in Russia, as McGeever describes, is that well, the problem for the Russian socialists in general across the spectrum was basically how to come to terms with the fact that Russia is a backward country in terms of sort of traditional class analysis, right? They were never, even in 1917, the masses that the traditional Marxist theory claimed would be the primary agent of the revolution. These masses were by no means proletarians. In Russia particularly, these masses were peasants, okay? And peasants did not have class consciousness. So they were attached to the land, to private property, and all the, the ideological apparatuses, the ideas that came with that. So the problem for the socialist movement in Russia, starting with the first wave of pogroms, was how to react to any fact of this populace actually raising up against the regime. Okay, how do you react to that? Should you welcome it? Should you join it? Should you ignore it? Should you do something else? And that was the main divisive point for the socialist movement itself in the Russian Empire. And that was also the moment when the Bolsheviks actually developed their attitude to the Jewish question, as it was called then, and to the problem of anti-Semitism in particular. So basically the cleavage was between populists, and that was also a socialist movement, which pretty much welcomed any kind of popular uprising against the regime, and the Social Democrats, which who saw that, okay, we have an uprising, but again, this is an uprising of the primarily peasant mass, which doesn't have a class consciousness required to make an actual revolution. So we have to be very careful about it. So the Social Democrats, who later came to be known as Bolsheviks, and there were also another group, Mensheviks, and they differed on certain political issues, which I'm not going to describe right now. But anyhow, the Social Democrats, they were very sort of decisive in their response to this first wave of pogroms, siding with the ethnos that suffered, with the Jews, and they issued statements on behalf of the Jews. They demanded certain actions to be taken, and so on and so forth. And that's actually, they sort of created the framework for the kinds of responses that would come later, when the second and the third wave of pogroms would come in the Russian Empire. And so the second wave came in the years 1903, 05. 1903 was, of course, the year of the famous Kishinev pogrom. And in his book, McGeever gives a lot of interesting details on how Social Democrats responded to these pogroms, and how they had these pogroms in mind when the actual wave of the revolution came in 1905. So in 1905, we had the so-called First Revolution in the Russian Empire. It was unsuccessful. It was very interesting, actually, to study religion and Marxism, because the event that started the revolution, it involved religion big time. And there was a demonstration right here in Leningrad, in St. Petersburg, in 1905. And the demonstration was to protest how the government treated the factory workers. And the demonstration was headed by a certain Orthodox priest by the name Grigory Gapon, who was a Ukrainian. And the demonstration was, was dispersed. Sorry if I'm not using the word correctly. The Cossacks and the troops were invited, and actually the demonstrators were shot at. And then a wave of violence started, both by the government and by the workers themselves. It continued here in St. Petersburg, and then moved to other places in Russia, in Moscow in particular, other places as well. But the fact of the matter is that this violence against the government also carried with it an anti-Semitic element. So there was a wave of pogroms in the Russian Empire. And the Social Democrats, the Bolsheviks, at that point, they also had to deal with it. So the book, in the first chapters, it actually describes what were the responses. Some of the interesting responses, actually, he notes, was how the Bolsheviks, in certain instances, had to curb the activity of the protesters. For example, it had to do with the May parades, the 1st of May, the day of the International Solidarity of the Workers. Okay, There had to be a traditional May Day gathering, a demonstration. And in certain cases, in certain cities, I think in Kiev as well, the current capital of Ukraine, the Social Democrats had to sort of push this down, this activity down, even prohibited demonstrations, because they were afraid that the day following the demonstration, because you have such a rise of popular sentiment and all sorts of people come to those protests and they don't necessarily have class consciousness. So the next day, the following day, there will be a wave of pogroms. And in many cases, such pogroms, in fact, were happening the following day after the workers came together to celebrate their unity. So these were the responses that the Bolsheviks had to create for themselves. And of course, when the 1917 comes, these kinds of responses, they solidify themselves. They sort of become afresh. The Bolsheviks pull them out of of their pockets, sort of political pockets, the kind of practices they have developed in the previous revolutionary wave, and they begin to put this same sorts of practice, same sorts of activities and practices in practice. Forgive my I'm starting to lose my English because I'm getting tired, I guess. But anyway, so there's a certain number of things they can do. They already know what they can do, and they put them in practice in the aftermath of the 1917. But the main, I'll be, since time is short, I will not be describing each and every section of the book, and that was my decision from the very beginning, actually, which I forgot to mention, that I basically want to concentrate on a few things that I personally carry from the book. So one thing I have already mentioned, that that anti-Semitism has to be approached, especially from a leftist perspective, as an intersectional issue. And that's the point the book drives home time and time again, that this is a confluence between race and class, and this is an uneasy confluence, and it has to be dealt with accordingly. So actually, one of the main arguments in the book is that whenever a response to anti-Semitism came during the first years of the Soviet power, the people who were driving this response, crafting this response, and these people, as I will be saying later, were primarily of Jewish origin themselves. But the problem for them was that with each step they were taking, in one or another way, could only reinforce the anti-Semitism that already existed in the country. So because these two things, race and class, again, they were so much entangled, and they are so much entangled now in our current situation, that this is still a problem both for the theory of the revolution, quote unquote, and for the practice. How do you actually come up with a movement, with a radical movement, the one that really brings liberation to the people it is focused on, but at the same time you avoid this wave of violence, which is not just a kind of a sort of sacred violence that Walter Benjamin describes in his book. The kind of violence that sort of spills out because there has been a whole heap of injustices made during history, and now you have to, simply the moment requires that this energy, this negative energy, be unleashed on those in power. But the fact of the matter is that this violence is more often unleashed on particular segments of the population. it is not just a generalized wave of violence. This wave of violence is unleashed on Jews specifically, and we still see this in many of the liberational movements today, probably, or in some other areas that would be other groups of the other ethnic groups of population, but still the coalescing issue for the anti-Semitic effort would be the fact that it is very difficult to distinguish between and divide between the class element and the race element, the ethnic element. So that's what the Bolsheviks had to struggle with all through their history, from the moment they started in the late 19th century and until, well, the book ends in the 1920s. So, but we all know that this history hasn't ended in the 1920s. So that's the first issue that I think is very relevant for the book. But the second important issue is that I personally carry from the book. Is of course the very issue of, well, I've touched upon that already, but that's the issue of anti-Semitism, and how do we understand what anti-Semitism is, and and how we, in particular, how do we approach this issue as Jews? If someone's identity is with Israel, okay, biblical Israel, or with Judaism, although Judaism is a difficult term, and we had another book club discussing Daniel Bayarin's book about Judaism. But anyway, if someone carries this Jewish identity, chooses this Jewish identity, what kind of a response to anti-Semitism should we develop? I think that's also the issue that the book poses. Why? Because everything that the author describes, Brendan McGeever, has to do with the specific activity of Jewish intellectuals and Jewish socialists who were involved in the revolutionary movement, but were not centrally involved, so to say. They did not belong to the core of the movement that made the revolution, meaning the Bolsheviks, that belonged to, well, what one can describe historically and sociologically to fringe parties, fringe movements, the ones associated with the Jewish national movement in the Russian Empire and then in the Soviet Russia. The movements like Bundists and other parties, and it's specifically, I think, what makes the book interesting for a Jewish audience is that it not only describes, it not only laments, I would say, this tragic series of pogroms that came in waves in the Russian Empire. And I've forgotten to mention that the third wave of pogroms came in 1918, 1919. I hope I'll have time to talk about it as well. But there was a series of pogroms that. So the book describes how the Jewish intellectuals did not just lament what was going on, how their kindred, their friends, their family were killed in those pogroms, but they were actively involved, and they chose to be involved in combating these pogroms, both on a theoretical level, on the level of what they were familiar with, and as I've mentioned, most of these people were intellectuals, so they spend a lot of time developing sort of ideological tools to combat anti-Semitism in the Soviet Russia, publishing leaflets, pushing for lectures to be given to workers, to soldiers in the Red Army, and so on and so forth, pushing the Soviet government and the Soviet government officials to pass this or that revolution, pushing them to actually intervene in a more serious fashion, like sending a battalion, sending troop to this or that area, inflamed by the anti-Semitic pogroms and violence. So the second thing I carry from the book is this issue of anti-Semitism and how a Jewish audience should react to it. And the book does a very good job describing the agency of these individuals. And that's the third thing, the agency. That they were not just passive observers, as I have mentioned, but they were actively involved. And the chapters of the book have very detailed descriptions in how these people who were coming from the fringe Zionist parties, leftist parties of all sorts of colors, like some of them were more Zionist oriented, others were not concerned about territory, but sought some other kind of autonomy or recognition for the Jews. But regardless of a particular coloring on that political map, the book talks about how specific, not just groups of people, but even specific individuals, how they pushed for the cause for the Jewish cause, the cause of combating anti-Semitism, despite all odds, despite the fact that there were always changes of power, even in the Soviet regime, one of the chapters describes how even when these Jewish intellectuals succeeded in having their voice heard by the government, after a matter of weeks, this particular Jewish organ, the Jewish Commissariat it was called, was disbanded just because of the fact that the government moved from Petersburg, Petrograd to Moscow, and there was a reshuffling of power between the central government, Sovnarkom, and its institutions. One of them that had to deal with an national issue was headed by Stalin, of all people. And then the earlier form of Jewish presence in the government was the Moscow Soviet, sort of the organ of the Moscow workers, which emerged during the revolution. Like no one planned actually for the Soviets to appear, and as we know, Lenin was initially very much against the Soviets, even from the time of the 1905 of the first revolution, because what was a Soviet? The Soviet was just people from a certain area, certain trade, certain profession coming together, trying to protect their interests, and trying to push the kinds of issues they were interested in. So it was a popular form of government. It didn't have any particular party orientation to it, even though later on parties started getting involved, and eventually the Bolsheviks put the Soviets under their foot. But anyhow, I mean, there were all these imbalances and changes of the power structure during the early years of the Soviet power. And these Jewish intellectuals who were coming from the fringe parties had to deal with it somehow, against all odds, against all changes. The book describes in detail how like the commissions they established after like working on it for months were quickly disbanded, but then they would not fall into a disappointment, but come back to the issue, recreate another commission and become involved in it and start pushing it for it again and again. And one of their colors, one of the sort of pictures the book draws very vividly, actually against the official Soviet historiography of how the Soviet government chose to deal with anti-Semitism and pogroms. Excuse me. So one of the pictures it draws very vividly is how the central government, even though it had this background from from the last decades of the 19th century of being against, on principle, being against the anti-Semitism, but every time a wave of pogroms came, the government was very slow in responding to that wave, starting with Lenin himself. So one of the discoveries actually that the author makes in the book is that this traditional picture that, you know, the Bolsheviks were always against anti-Semitism. Well, it's true, but it is true, but only to a degree, because yes, they were against on principle, but when it came to actually issuing a decree, issuing an order, you know, for certain troops to be sent to a certain area to disband the pogrom, or even, you know, when it came to passing a resolution that would initiate this whole process for the local communities, they were very, very slow, starting with Lenin himself, I would say. So the book describes how these Jewish intellectuals were like pushing and pushing and pushing the government, sending letters to Lenin, sending letters to other Jews in the government. And another thing is that the book very vividly describes this difference between the Jewish intellectuals I've been talking about and politicians, and those Jews, formal Jews in the government, the likes of Trotsky and Zinoviev and others, for whom, you know, Jewishness was, I mean, they did recognize it, and they did recognize themselves as being part of the ethnos. Even Trotsky himself, in one of his speeches in the 20s, he had to say that I actually never accepted Lenin's invitation to join the government in any leading role, because I was always aware that I'm a Jew and that would create a problem for the populace. But still, the reaction of the people who were in the government and held some positions, and Trotsky himself, because he was the head of the army, it was very slow. So this Jewish intellectual had to push and push and push again. They were never disappointed when the facts were against them. So this question of agency of the Jewish intellectuals, how you react to anti-Semitism, is one of the things that the book draws very well. Another thing that connected to it is, of course, the issue of the education. Okay, and perhaps that's one of the things that one can critique the book for a little bit, because on the one hand, it draws a very good picture of the kinds of efforts that these Jewish intellectuals were making, and they always concerned, as I have mentioned, sort of propaganda, you know, the ideas. So they wrote letters, they initiated campaigns, lectures, they sent people to speak to the army, to the soldiers in the army, and so on and so forth. But I think, on the other hand, the author tends to ignore or overlook, I would say, how this whole emphasis on education was not only a moral concern, as he calls it, for these Jewish individuals who were trying to influence the government, but it also part of the general sort of cultural milieu they came from. Even though many of them, as he makes clear, were never educated in yeshivas or heder. Many of them went to secular universities and so on. But still, I think this element that education is a big aspect of being Jewish is very important. It is now, and I think it was today. And actually, one of my colleagues, she makes a similar argument, even for the Russian element in the revolution, that the cultural element was very important, especially in the whole history around the Soviets and this locus of power. So that's the issue of education. And another issue actually is the issue of Soviets themselves, because the book shows how these Jewish intellectuals were trying to influence the decision process, trying to work on a local level very often. Yes, they would address the government directly, write to Lenin and other people in the government, in the central government. But on the other hand, for them, the experience of anti-Semitism was very much a local thing as well. It was a general thing, for them as Jews, but it was a local thing as well. So, for example, when the wave of pogroms in Ukraine came in 1919, the book describes how these people actually carried their memories of the pogrom, which they developed around the years of 1905-06, during the years of the first Russian Revolution, and how they pushed the local governments, the local Soviets, to adopt certain measures to combat anti-Semitism. So that's the issue of education. And finally, I think the book also addresses and makes one think about the question about what is a Jewish national project. Okay, this centuries, maybe even millennia old question, what kind of government the Jews want, what kind of sort of national existence. So this book shows how Jewish intellectuals who were not centrally involved in the revolution, with time reassessed their estrangement, which came not because of themselves, but because of other things as well, even independent on how Bolsheviks themselves dealt with other parties. And it's a problem in itself how you approach this. But still, there were this effort on behalf of this, on the part of these Jewish intellectuals, to put their aspiration for a Jewish state, a Jewish national existence, in concrete practice, sort of to not just to dream of a messianic age that would one time realize itself on earth, but to somehow work so that this age actually comes about. I know time is short, and we still need to do some questions, right? But yeah, do I have a minute?
Yes, we have a question from Rabbi.
Okay.
Have you seen it?
Oh, no, not yet. Where is it? Is it on my WhatsApp? All right. Oh, can you read it maybe?
Mm-hmm. So we have a comment and a question from Rabbi Alexander Dukhovny. Thank you, Sergei, for the interesting presentation. Question: does the author present the situation about the anti-Semitism when Jews received the citizenship right after the February 1917?
Yes, he does. That's the first chapter. He describes it in an interesting fact that actually. I think the first session of the Second Congress, the session, well, he describes a session of a certain organ, I forgot the name, maybe it was a Congress of the Soviets, which happened shortly after the February Revolution, and it falls on the eve of Passover. So there is a Jewish delegate. Yeah, that was the session of the Petrograd Soviet. And the Jewish delegate comes up and he makes a speech, and he compares the February Revolution to actually how Jews were liberated from Egypt. So there was a lot of course, across the spectrum of the Russian population, people were welcoming the February Revolution. It was a very liberatory, emancipatory event for everyone, and Jews in particular. Yeah. So yeah, he does describe it. But anyway, I will probably leave you with, if I have a minute, I will leave you with a clip, a YouTube clip. It doesn't come from the 20s, it comes from the 1936, and it is song from a Soviet movie Circus. Well, do I have time to describe it? But I think it sort of captures this utopian moment that these Jewish intellectuals were aiming at in the 20s and early in the 1917, 1918, and so forth. And that's the moment when all nationalities would come together, you know, and regardless of your ethnicity, you will have a voice. Okay, so the movie, which comes from Stalin's epoch, but it describes and it actually connects with this issue of intersectionality and race, because the main actress, she's a circus performer, and she comes on a tour to the Soviet Union from the United States, and there's a bad American entrepreneur who wants to put her into trouble. So at one point he makes, you know, a public announcement that the girl has a baby who is African, okay, who is black, and the critical scene happens during the performance, and the clip is about how people react to it. And there's actually a line in Yiddish in the lullaby that people in the audience, in the circle audience, start singing to this African black kid, black baby. And the main message of the clip is that, you know, regardless of your color or ethnicity, you know, you have a room in this new life in the Soviet Union. So I will leave you with this clip. I very much recommend to read the book, and here it comes. Thank you for being with me tonight. Okay, hold on. Oh, demonstrate. Hold on. Where's the clip? I don't have the clip. No.
While they're looking for a clip, the comment from Ellen Vershaw: thank you, Sergei, for teaching us this important part of the history of anti-Semitism in Russia. Okay, all right. Thank you very much, everyone. You need to open first and then share. Yeah. Okay. Can you hear? Can you see it? So this is when the bad guy announces that the baby is black. And that's the performer to the right, like a Russian friend. Okay, and I'll skip some. So there's the baby crying, and then there's this utopian moment when people start passing the kid around. Okay, everybody's happy. Yeah, the bad guy is of course put to shame, and then a lullaby starts. And it comes in different languages. First in Russian, and then there's Samuel McCoyles. Okay, hold on. There's Ukrainian as well. Where's the McCoyles? That's the McCoyles. He sings in Yiddish in this movie. Actually, I read the Wikipedia that this McCoyles, his singing in English was removed during Stalin's period. They put it back when the movie was restored. But anyway, this sort of shows you how the Jewish intellectuals themselves, and the book describes how they were so interested in Yiddishkeit, Yiddishism, how they were involved in this utopian language, not only combating anti-Semitism, but creating a world for each and every nation on earth.
Спят медведи и слоны, дяди спят и тети, все вокруг спать должны, но не на работе.
Okay. Thank you. No, I don't hear you.
Спасибо большое. Thank you very much. It was very interesting, and stay with us. Next session is at 7 p.m. in Jerusalem time, and it will be Rabbi Nathan Alfred. The session will be also in English, so stay with us. Дорогие друзья, следующая сессия у нас в 5 часов по израильскому времени. Выступает раввин Натан Альфред. Оставайтесь с нами, подключайтесь. Хорошего продолжения конференции.